Boris Johnson's two closest advisors during the COVID pandemic are currently giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. One of them is up today, former Downing Street Director of Communications, Cain. He faced the music this morning, but this afternoon, his boss, basically former chief advisor Dominic Cummings, will dish the dirt on his boss, who was, of course, Boris Johnson. Joining me now is founder of the campaign group Us For Them, Molly Kingsley, who's been a stalwart at posing questions and asking the right questions about the COVID inquiry and trying to get the COVID inquiry to get some sense out of some of the people that they've been seeing. Molly, welcome to the show. Good afternoon. Good to see you. Incredible, really, some of the stuff that's been coming out over the last couple of days, including, of course, that even his own advisors thought that Boris Johnson and the government looked like a tragic joke, saying that they had lots of ideas which were described best on this show as BS, complete and utter rubbish. Cain has been reading this morning from various messages between ministers, which seems to be more full of swear words than anything else. I mean, I've been hearkening back to those days, as you and I have been speaking so many times over the years. And it's hard to believe, really, isn't it, that we had a government that was running the country in a way which was so slapdash and kind of off the cuff that if we'd known at the time that that was what they were doing, I don't think any of us would have done the things that they were asking.
No, and I mean, there's various strands, I think, coming out of the hearings of the last week or so. And I think the first is, as you said, and, the one that most of the media have picked up on is just this absolute chaos. I mean, we had Cummings refer to Boris as the shopping trolley kind of careering all over the place, not landing on any policy decision. That's possibly a bit unfair, actually, but that is very, very much the impression that comes across. And I think you have this, idea of just infighting that would be more appropriate in a kind of medieval court, not a modern government. It is really shocking to see it. And there does seem to be an acknowledgement in the WhatsApp. So there was a very revealing comment, I thought, in one of Simon Case's messages that was shown to the inquiry last week, that the government was suffering, even in 2020, from this massive trust deficit. And you kind of think, well, should that have surprised them, given how they were running the country?
Right. Well, I mean, many of us, and I think you would probably be among them, suspected that this was what was going on, that some of their instructions, those daily briefings that they gave, were so bizarre that you thought to yourself, well, this can't be based on anything. Surely it's not scientific to have, 10 tables of 6 people as opposed to 6 tables of 10 people. And, if you have a Scotch egg when you have a pint, then that'll be OK, but it won't be if you don't. Like if you stand up in a restaurant, you have to put your mask on, but if you sit down, you can't get COVID. I mean, I found myself going over and over all of the things that we were told over the past. And I can't get that image of Dominic Cummings running out of Downing Street out of my head either.
No, and you know what, Mike, you've done more in that case, more critical thinking than the COVID inquiry, because, you're entirely right, of course. I mean, I think we know beyond any doubt now that most, if not all, of the key pandemic decisions were not based on evidence, or at least that the evidence in favour of the interventions was inflated. So, the idea that lockdowns would work, that masking people would work was inflated, and the harms of those interventions was downplayed. But whereas you have very rightly identified this, and I think, it's an issue we've talked a lot about, isn't it? We've hardly to hear about this side of things from the COVID inquiry. So I think, to be fair to the inquiry, it is proving a valuable exercise in highlighting the carnage within Downing Street. And there's obviously a whole host of questions, and I'm sure we'll get onto the WhatsApps and the kind of communications and the lack of adherence to the Nolan principles that's coming through. So, the inquiry is proving useful, I think, on that front. But in terms of actually addressing the core question, were lockdowns legitimate, and were the interventions used to curb the virus legitimate? In other words, were they was the cure worse than the disease? The inquiry isn't really touching on this, and instead it's starting from its own preconceived idea that lockdowns were needed, and that really what had to happen is we needed to lock down harder, faster, sooner.
Yeah. I mean, at least, if nothing else, I suppose what it's making us all do is remember what it was like, because it does seem like a different era. I was saying this to somebody yesterday. It seems so long ago. when we were in that kind of weird place, you know, where I remember getting in my car, driving to the office here when nobody was on the road, at the very beginning, walking into a building where there wasn't anyone literally sort of manning the front desk, and it was just completely like a ghost town. And to think of how all that kind of played out, and how I didn't see my children for 8 weeks. I didn't see my mother or my daughter because they lived in other countries and I couldn't go and see them. All of that stuff now seems kind of like a dream. So it's good that we're having it brought back and we're being reminded of it, I think. But also, the thing that I find puzzling is the different messages that seem to be coming out about Boris Johnson. You know, on the one hand, you know, he was lax and he didn't care and he wasn't sure. On the other hand, we read yesterday that he actually favoured the Swedish model and didn't want any longer to lock anybody up. And he thought that, you know, it wasn't worth. We saw messages from him where he said, you know, is there any point in doing all this just to save the lives of a few people who are going to die anyway?
And I mean, I think there's a few points that say, yeah, look, absolutely. In a way, it is good we're being reminded of it. But I think, you know, what I'm really concerned about is that we do appear to be setting up a narrative that actually lockdown is necessary, that it was a good thing, and that actually that should be our default go-to in a future pandemic. And I think this is really, really troubling. You know, on that basis, the inquiry is worse than useless. It's actually at risk of setting us up for a very, very dangerous, you know, repeat of what's just happened. I think the point about Johnson, and this is what I said at the beginning, I think it's a little bit more complicated than just, you know, pinning the blame on him to be this chaotic leader. You know, I think his instincts were probably right. And you know, I don't know if you saw Sunetra Gupta, who is one of the scientists, you know, very, very critical of lockdown, very, very balanced lady. She has submitted a witness statement to the inquiry. She's not being called to give evidence to the inquiry, which in my view is a great, great shame. But her witness statement really supports this idea that Johnson had at the beginning, you know, of supporting the Swedish approach. And she is absolutely eviscerating in a very understated way about lockdowns, about the fact they were known to cause such egregious harm from the very beginning. And she says, and I've got it in front of me, she said, you know, we betrayed the precautionary principle by adopting a strategy which was certain to cause harm, but whose benefits were entirely unclear. And I think that was very much Johnson's instincts at the beginning. And again, in the September 2020, you know, few weeks where they were debating a second lockdown. And it is a real, real shame that he did not have the courage to stick to his convictions.
Yes, I think that is the part of the problem, I suppose, and that's what you get, isn't it, if you have somebody who's indecisive and who kind of is unfit in a way for that office. I mean, we were all very excited when Boris Johnson was elected, and I think had COVID not come along, he could have been a great Prime Minister. He could have got Brexit done properly. He could have led Britain into this new era of kind of, you know, self-determination and partaking in all sorts of great global benefits, aside from being inside the European Union. But it all got kiboshed by COVID, and I think he was the wrong kind of Prime Minister to be in charge of it.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. I mean, I guess I would add, I don't know which Prime Minister would have been right, because the reality is that, at least in recent years, all our Prime Ministers are swayed far too much by popular opinion and polling. And, you know, because in part of the fear that the government had stoked up, you know, there was support. It is undeniable. There was support for lockdowns. Yeah. So, you know, would Rishi have done any better? I mean, I doubt it in the heat of the moment. And I think there's a real question. And again, it's a question that the COVID inquiry just this morning, they had Lee Cain, who was director of the government's communication strategy during the key period of the pandemic. And, you know, he was quizzed. He was lightly quizzed, I would say, on the use of that very manipulative, you remember, you know, stay at home, protect the NHS. Yeah. He was quizzed for about 5 minutes on that. Now, given that arguably that campaign set the tone for the entire pandemic and the series of really disastrous interventions that followed, you know, 5 minutes of quizzing, I mean, it really, really lied.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. Also, unbelievably, Molly, you and I have had this conversation now for about 7 or 8 minutes. We haven't mentioned our children and what the ongoing and long-lasting effects have been on our children, you know, many of whom are still certainly teenagers who have had a huge chunk of their life sort of more or less taken away from them and are still struggling now to kind of recover from that.
Yeah, they are. And I think it's a really sad thing that the children module in the inquiry won't be for, I mean, what, another year at least, possibly longer. It is far too long, as we've said before, Mike, far too long for children. And it is far too long for the lessons to be learned. And, you know, I am very worried, as I said, about the prospect of there being another lockdown for another virus and actually the same mistakes being repeated. I would not be confident that we would not see school closures again based on the way this inquiry is going. Certainly, I think we would see some kind of lockdown again were there another pandemic. And this is why, really, the examination of the harms for children and for other vulnerable members of society, it's not just kids that were so badly hit, but it's why they really should have been placed front and centre at this inquiry. And they just haven't been. And I don't see that changing now.
No, I think that is a problem, isn't it? But that's the other thing that you see sort of creepily happening, where you've got reports coming in from different parts of the country, hospitals now insisting everybody wearing masks again because there's a new COVID outbreak, more people getting COVID, and certain people, including those at Sage, who are still advising the government, believe it or not, saying, oh, well, we might be prepared for another hard winter, and it could be, go and get your vaccinations, there's another COVID wave coming. They won't stop, will they?
No, they won't. And, we've seen throughout the pandemic, we saw this pedestaling of the science and the scientists, even when we now know the scientific evidence was very disputed in places. And unfortunately, that is the line the inquiry has taken. I can tell you now what the inquiry is going to say. It will conclude in 3 to 7 years from now, cost everyone about 250 million pounds. And it will, by and large, say the scientists were right. The real problem was that government didn't listen to them. They didn't lock down sooner. There was a bit of collateral damage, but it was unavoidable. Oh, and let's all wear masks next time a pandemic comes along. And, we will have learned nothing. As it appears, Mike, we're learning nothing now. I mean, why are masks being brought back? We know that they don't work. It's crazy to keep repeating these measures that have failed. Where's the common sense?
Well, there is no common sense. There's just more virtue signalling, I'm afraid. But we can only do what we can do, Molly. We'll continue to fight the good fight, and with your help, we shall win this time. Molly, thanks very much indeed.